we start by asking, well, what are people already doing? And that seems like a useful, or I found it a useful starting point, and it shifts certain kinds of intellectual discussions into more practical ones. So similarly with the question of democracy, I mean, I could, and I probably have, think about, well, what did Jefferson mean by republicanism? Or what did, I could do it in a scholarly mode, but I find it equally useful to say, well, okay, what do the Zapatistas think is, would be democracy, or what they think is good government, and start from what they think and move to the theoretical work from their theoretical work, right? I don't think it's really a practice theory division. It's a level, it's different kinds of theory, or theory in different atmospheres, different contexts, which I find both useful, both the university one and the social movement one.
And I think that's right. That to imagine that the movements out there are worried about practice, but we in the university will do the theory for them. I think it's sort of spectacularly arrogant, and that's one of the reasons why I'm very honoured to be here with Michael, because he's been a pioneer in this for decades, though he does look that old. But I guess, I think that's right, and in fact, one of the movements that I'm interested in, the shack dweller movement in South Africa, Abahlali Basem Jondolo is the name of this, it's Zulu for people who live in shacks, and they have a way, I think, of resolving this idea of limits and limitlessness. And again, if we think about the commons as, on the one hand, look, if you just think about things that are called the commons, it's usually land that was probably nicer than it is now. And it's now a park, or it's now a shopping mall, whatever it is, it's the common. And the commons, understanding the commons as stuff is a shorthand for understanding where environmentalists are coming from. Their priorities are about the finitude of the earth and its carrying capacity and the resources that are available to us. But the rules, but understanding that the project of changing the rules that govern that stuff seems to be where a lot of the anti-capitalist protesters are working magic. And understanding that the project of everything for everyone as a direct confrontation to the privatization of the stuff that is already limited and already desecrating it. Understanding there's actually two ways of coming at the same question of the commons seems to me a way that some movements have already tried to resolve this problem. And I'm thinking now really of this shack dweller movement in South Africa, who are at the moment confronting not a crisis of the common, but really a crisis of capitalism. I think that if we understand neoliberalism, as Pierre Bourdieu does, as a program for the methodical destruction of collectives, if we understand that part of what neoliberalism does is try and individuate and try and render impossible the idea of collectives. At the same time, of course, it's a contradictory process. It produces these collectives. In particular, it produces slums. It produces communities of people who are there to service capital, but who can never be seen by capital. So it produces communities of migrant workers. It produces communities of people who are there almost artificially in communities to provide the reproductive labor, productive labor that capitalism needs in order to survive. Now, what's going on in South Africa at the moment is that there's an election going on, and movements over the past, it's nearly 20 years now, have waited for democracy and development. I think this is the other sort of term that we're playing with here, to arrive. And in the meantime, there's a sort of, and that's of course one of the things about development, is that particularly in the global south, development is about patience and a sort of begging posture. Development is the kind of thing that development agencies do to the people who are about to be developed. I mean, there's I very briefly, and my continuing chain, worked for the World Bank. And when I worked for the World Bank, the project I worked on was a project called Voices of the Poor, Can Anyone Hear Us? which was about the World Bank. Basically, I mean, it was like World Bank. We had lunch with the poor. Yes, they love us. At the end of Voice of the Poor, Can Anyone Hear Us? And this is almost a verbatim quote. There's a pull from there's a long quotation from a consultant's report in this World Bank document, and the consultant's report read something like this. It was, and so the sun was setting on the African savannah as we drove up to the village, and spontaneously the women rose up and danced around the fire, and here is the song that they sang. And they sang, "Here are the World Bank, here are the World Bank, they are here to develop us, we hope they won't forget us." The last line is, will we forget? As opposed to will we develop, which of course was a given. It seems to me that this idea of development is sort of coterminous with democracy. Democracy is what you do to people. And in that sense, you know, there's a sort of standard joke about, well, now that Obama has been elected, we have been sort of encouraged to sort of sit back and let Obama be the bringer of change and hope. That he will be the pizza delivery dude of change. And he will bring hot, fresh, steaming change in one term. Now, it seems to me that view of democracy roundly deserves to be mocked, and that view of development, which is essentially the same in many ways coterminous, deserves to be mocked. But what the Abahlali Basim John Dola Shakvela's movement is doing in South Africa, seems to me, is developing other kinds of community and other kinds of ways of developing their community, in which they are not the passive recipients of development, nor the passive voters, but rather through the claim of no land, no house, no vote, they claim a position to be able to govern themselves. Autonomy is one way of thinking about them, but actually what they want is sovereignty. And I think that this would be a sort of fun term to sort of throw around as well, that if we're thinking about commons and we're thinking about how we might govern resources together, sovereignty is an interesting term to play with, because usually it is only the state to which sovereignty is permitted. And what it seems to me that the shack dwellers movement is demanding is sovereignty over the resources that can and should come into their communities. So sovereignty over electricity, over water, over but also over employment opportunities, over the entitlements that the state is already giving. And it seems to me that through a range of sort of shack dweller politics in South Africa, you are seeing an attempt to reclaim a right to govern, to manage the stuff which is limited, and which people in shacks well know. They're very happy, for example, to pay for taxes, to pay for water, which I think is very interesting, that people agree that actually, in order for us to have water, we understand that there is a cost and we must work for it and we must do things for it. Now, whether it is giving it a check to the municipality or whether it is organizing labor and production and community work in a different way remains to be seen. But people are happy to work for water, understanding that it is something that is within their common. But the one thing that they're not prepared to do is wait for the government to give it to them. Because it is precisely patience that has run out in these communities in Southern Africa. And I think that that's very interesting, particularly when one thinks about sort of global shack dweller politics, where there are already 1 billion people who live in shacks and informal settlements around the world, and we can expect many more. These communities that are being created by capitalism, even as neoliberalism, as I say, as a project of destroying communities, annihilates other kinds of sort of organizing spaces and opportunities. Within South Africa, at least within these shack dweller communities, you are seeing a move towards an understanding both of limitlessness of people's power, but also the limitedness of the resources which they seek to govern.
I want to pick up on one thing about development. We're still good for time. She's shaking her head. Okay, good. It does seem to be part of what's involved here. Now, shifting a little bit, because Raj already made the shift, or linked a question of democracy to a question of development. And it occurs to me that we need to rethink what we understand as development. And maybe even before rethink what we understand as development, first understand what they think, meaning the World Bank, the major NGOs, and even a series of major governments. What do they think is development? Because I think that has changed rather radically in the last, certainly 50 years and maybe even the last 20 years. I mean, the notion of development that they came, they say, roughly after World War II. The second half of the 20th century was largely tied to growth, and growth specifically of gross national product.